selection and heifer development, and it's focused on identifying genetic and environmental factors influencing reproductive efficiency in the beef cow. So with that, Bob, I welcome you to our meeting today, and I will turn the table to you.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Sounds great.
And Mary, have I got my slides right?
Yep, looks good.
And they're advancing?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. Okay, so I do apologize about not being there today, and I just want you all to know that it was mostly about bad planning. My laboratory has a production cycle just like everything else. At Mark, we breed in the fall and in the spring, and those become our two intensive times for being out ultrasounding, collecting blood samples, tissue samples, and all that type of thing. And late summer and winter become the time when we crank samples through the lab. And I considered two potential plans: the plan where we were in person on center, and the plan where we were zooming anyway. And with those two options, I figured we could keep samples moving through the lab and I could run back and forth from building to building. But I did not consider the possibility of us being 4 miles away. And so everybody was gracious enough to just let me be here so that we could keep our samples moving. And I do appreciate that. Like I said, I'm happy to be with you today. Want to take a little while to talk to you about what we know about developing heifers in a dry lot, and then I'll tell you that the answer to this question is actually not a lot, even for the first half of the phrasing you'll see, and then for the dry lot too. And I've been working on this for a number of years, and I just find it amazing how I still find things that make me go, it's not quite what I thought it was. This research has a lot of ties to the University of Nebraska, and then I'll kind of show that as we go through it, with our most recent tie being our hiring of Dr. Snyder, who was a postdoc in Dr. Cupp's lab, and we'll keep coming back to Dr. Cupp's lab and Dr. Funston's lab with a lot of this stuff. But we just brought her on board in the last month or so, and she is already adding greatly to this project. Okay, so this slide was one I put in last month when we did this, and I put it in the day of as I listened to Travis and Casey's talks and Clayton's presentation. And once again, I'll admit I've been in and out of the room today, so I am assuming to some degree that they gave the same talks. If at any point during my talk I make a reference to something that they may have said that they didn't say, assume that's on me and not on them. But how does what I'm about to talk to you about fit in with what we should have, at least in broad scheme, been talking about today? So I'm pretty sure Travis covered some degree of developmental programming in a large portion of my research program. And what I'm going to show you right now deals with developmental programming, maybe not quite fetal programming, which is probably where Travis focused, and we do some fetal programming, but this one is more about just nutritional programming and developmental programming of the heifer. And one of the take homes that you should get from my talk, and you probably got from Travis's talk and from Casey's talk, is that not everything we do has just an immediate response. And that is something that we really, really need to keep considering and thinking about all the time, right? Casey should have shown you that when we used artificial insemination and synchronization, that those heifers have a greater lifetime productivity. So that is more of a management situation where we manage them early, and we might not like all the labor and work that goes into that. And that's going to be true for almost any of these technologies that any of us are talking about. But it's keeping in mind that idea that there might be long-term responses that really help. And the opposite, I like the optimistic side, but the opposite of that would be that idea that you can also do things that can really hurt yourself long-term, right? So what are the long-term implications of how we develop replacement heifers? And Clay did say the bit about using the estrus technology in the dry lot a little bit more. We have it on heifers out on pasture as well here. But I would partially make the argument that assisted reproductive technologies can be a little bit easier, and notice that that's in quotes, in a dry lot, right? I realize all the work that goes into it. For Dr. Snyder's program, we are getting ready this spring to try to do some multiple ovulation and flush some embryos. We're not necessarily going to transfers at this point, but that around the clock, every 12-hour injections of FSH and all in that situation, which is a lot more than synchronization, I realize is not easy, no matter whether you're in a dry lot or whether you're out in pasture or whatever. So let's talk about the economics just a little bit. This is a paper that Travis put together back in 2013, or data from the paper. And it does show that heifers developed in a dry lot do not have a successful return on investment. It costs more and you have decreased returns compared to heifers developed on pasture. Although we have to keeping in mind, and I didn't get to my disclaimer, but the other disclaimer that I'm going to throw out here is that I'm not necessarily showing you the pros or cons of either side of any of this, because you're going to see some data further on that might make you think that I'm saying that dry lots are bad. And that is not necessarily my interpretation of it. My interpretation is we still need to understand what we're doing and how we're doing it and try to optimize it. But again, so dry lots become a little bit more interesting because the price of pasture keeps trending upward. As I referred to a minute ago, reproductive management becomes a little bit easier when we're in a dry lot. And this is all relative. We can argue about it and go back and forth. And I realize that you still have to put the word easier in perspective. There's still time and there's still labor, but you can get them in a little bit easier and that type of thing. It's easier to set up for detection of estrus. We're still using the old collar system right now, but the types of things that Clay talked about in terms of, at least from a research process, being able to see what our developmental programming does to those heifers, look at the intensity of the estrus, look at the regularity of the estrus cycles, all of those types of things for us become a research way of using it that I realized wouldn't necessarily be why an average producer would be using it. But there's a lot of information there, like Clay said, that can really help you if you know how to use these systems. So they are a bit easier in a dry lot type of setting. It's easier to get them in to do the reproductive tract scoring, which for those of you who know me know that this is really a big part of what my research program is and a big part of what we'll be getting to here. Synchronization of estrus, artificial insemination. If you wanted to go to some type of assisted reproductive technologies that included flushing embryos or transferring embryos, obviously having a little bit easier access to the animals is going to make that a little bit easier. There are behavioral changes that go with raising heifers in a dry lot, right? Heifers that are raised in a dry lot and then move to pasture tend to lose body weight in that first month. And it seems to be due to needing to learn grazing behavior, okay? So this is a study that my collaborator, George Perry, did several years ago, where the heifers were raised in the dry lot and artificially inseminated there and then moved to forage. And they had a decrease in pregnancy rate to timed artificial insemination of about 10 percentage points. And the main factor driving this was that in the first 7 days after they went to pasture, those heifers that were not experienced with grazing lost a considerable amount of body weight, right? And that's because they spent a lot of time walking the pasture, looking for the feed bunk, looking for a feed truck instead of just grazing. So we do have to keep in mind that we at least have to have strategies for how we're going to handle this if we're raising heifers in a dry lot and transferring them or that type of thing. So then we start to get into some stuff that really starts to pique my interest in terms of the long-term development of heifers and maintaining them for a long and fertile reproductive life. And again, this is some of Travis's data. And if we just compare at least essentially this last column, one of the things that you can take out of this is that compared to the two groups that were raised on stocks, the heifers that were raised in the dry lot fell out of the herd a lot faster, okay? And we see this here at Clay Center or at the Meat Animal Research Center, and this somewhat reproductive disadvantage of heifers that are raised in a dry lot. Okay, now it could potentially be all back to that previous slide that I just showed you, but I don't necessarily believe that that's why it happens. This is some data from Rick Funston's group showing that the heifers that were raised in a dry lot had a puberty advantage, which did lead to a tendency for an advantage to AI, which is exactly what you would expect with that type of thing. But that overall, in terms of looking at pregnancy rate for the full breeding season, it didn't necessarily translate to any advantage or disadvantage for the dry lot heifers, right? And if anything, you would argue, why would dry lot heifers fall out earlier if they did better at attaining puberty? So in some ways it's backwards, and in some ways it's just partially suggesting that we don't see an overall effect on pregnancy rates. So then we get into the idea that if we believe this is true, even before in some ways we had some of this data, people were already looking at ways to prepare dry lot heifers for moving them, right? And there were a lot of studies. This one is a classic study from UNL looking at how we develop heifers and how they get to that 55 to 60% of mature weight that Casey was talking about, and whether it does or does not impact puberty and fertility. So heifers were either raised on essentially a constant gain, or they were fed at a low rate of gain early and then bumped up as they came to the breeding season. And part of the reason we do this is just to make sure that they do reach puberty at the time they need to. And then those that were set up to gain really quick early after weaning and then kind of maintained going into breeding. And in that study, there was no difference in age at puberty and no difference in pregnancy rates, okay? So this is a similar type of study that only looked at the late gain model. So holding them back early and then starting to bring them up as we hit the breeding season. And again, there was no difference in pregnancy rates, but it did decrease the feed costs by about 10%, okay? So minimally from a bottom line dollar type of point of view, it seems like by developing them a bit slower in the dry lot and then bringing them on, that we can decrease the feed costs. So when I joined the Meat Animal Research Center in 2003, Harvey Freetley was already here as a nutritionist and animal scientist and had already generated some data very similar to what I'm about to show you. I'm going to show you the next graph because it's a paper that we're in the process of getting published that I'm actually on. So why wouldn't I pick the data that I'm on to present versus the earlier data? But what Dr. Freetley has shown through a number of studies is that the herd survival is greater in what he calls these stair-step heifers, these ones that are developed slowly at first and then stepped up to a higher rate of gain right before breeding than in heifers that are raised as a constant gain. So this translates out to about a 6% difference, but it is significant in survival rate after 6 calves for the stair-step heifers. And since all of these heifers were raised in a dry lot, just either on constant gain or in a stair-step type protocol, we can assume that this is not grazing behavior, right? Because none of them had learned that. And so when I first got here, Dr. Funston was here one day visiting, and Harvey and he were talking about this, and they brought me into the office and they asked me if I thought it was adaptation. This idea that if you get them used to eating less, then once they get out on the grass in a bad year as a cow, they're going to be a little bit more adapted toward being able to survive on less, right? And I'm not absolutely saying that none of this is adaptation, but again, as strange as it is, I'm trained as an ovarian physiologist. Why would anybody want to be trained as an ovarian physiologist? But I am, and it is where my interest lays. So I looked at them and said, well, there's a lot of data in the rat to suggest developmental programming of the ovary. which again gets us back to what I said earlier, and we're still hitting on, and is one of the themes of the day. Not everything that we do has just an immediate response, and we have to keep thinking about the long terms of this. So what are the mechanisms? Are they adaptation, and I realize that adaptation is a physiological response. But when I say physiology, now I'm moving more like toward ovarian physiology. So what I explained to Rick and Harvey that day was that there were already studies coming out in rats to show that in the peripubertal period, if you fed a high energy diet and really kind of cranked how much they were eating, that what would happen is they would start activating their primordial follicles. And that's these little ones right here. Those are the quiescent follicles in the ovary. Each one contains an egg. That is all the eggs that a female has for her reproductive lifespan. And depletion of this egg supply is what leads to reproductive senescence or menopause in the higher primate type species, okay? So I told them that I thought that potentially the stair steps having a lower amount of energy in that peripubertal window were sparing their ovarian reserve, the number of these microscopic follicles that were in their ovary. Now, Rick and Harvey both made the most logical argument in the world that they could make to me, which was the fact that rats are not ruminants. And I said, that's absolutely true. And we argued about it for quite some time, I will admit. And it took me quite a while to get Harvey to the point where we actually did our first experiment where we pulled some of them off besides sending them to production and collected the ovaries to look at it. So the very first paper Harvey published in 2014. But what amazes me about this is how well it has repeated over a number of studies. And when I say that, I will tell you, even I am still not sure I believe this, but every time I think I don't believe it, we get a new set of data that holds up and shows it happening again, okay? So these figures are actually from the 2015 paper, just to kind of show those targets. So the constant gain are gaining about 1 kilogram, 2 pounds a day versus a half a kilogram in the stair steps from 8 months to 11 months of age. And then at 11 months of age, we kind of bump the stair steps up to get them to where they need to be while we try to keep the constant gain right where they should be. Our usual target here is about a half and about 1.2. And again, I like to tease Harvey, but I also realize that this is harder to do than it looks like, right? To really be checking those animals every couple of weeks and keeping a track on their gains and figuring it out and keeping it in these windows. So he didn't necessarily miss by much here or overshoot or anything by all that much. He does a fantastic job. And in Olivia Amundsen's study, we actually collected the ovaries and did a time course to look at what was going on in terms of these primordial follicle numbers. And what you see is that after the 11 months, about the time that we would have started refeeding them, that you see a decrease in the constant gain compared to the stair steps. So it really does, I realize they're getting refed, but if you put this together with the mouse model, what it looks like, or the rat model, what it looks like is an increased rate of activation, which is exactly what happens in rat models when you feed them a high fat diet. When you caloric restrict rats, then they increase the number of primordial follicles in their ovaries in this period. So it seems like the energy that the constant gain are getting are driving these follicles into the growing pool. Like I said, we've done 3 actual studies, generated 4 papers, one with Dr. Cupp's lab at UNL. The most recent one was at New Mexico. So 2 of the studies were at Clay Center. One of them was for Shelby Rosasco's PhD dissertation at New Mexico. So Shelby was Adam Summers' first PhD student. And for those of you who don't know the connection, Adam did his PhD and postdoc with Dr. Funston and Dr. Cupp, moved to New Mexico, and he was already beginning to become intrigued by what we were doing with the stair step model. So he convinced Shelby that for her PhD, I convinced her a little bit, and she was just smart enough to also be interested in the whole subject matter. But we convinced her to do another stair-step study for her PhD, and I'll get back to that in a couple of minutes. But before we go there, I just want to talk a little bit more about the importance of increased follicle numbers, because in general, it's kind of one of the focus areas of my lab, right? So the easy way to do this from a production standpoint and not take the ovaries out to do the histology is to do an ultrasound of her ovaries and count these black circles, which are the antral follicles, or the latest stage of development. In women, in cattle, in walruses, in rhinoceroses, in all kinds of mammalian species, the number of these black circles that you can count on the ultrasound screen correlate, not perfectly, but strongly and consistently with the number of microscopic primordial follicles. So when women are having fertility problems and when women are getting close to the age of menopause and their doctors are trying to figure out what's going on, a lot of times they'll get these scans because by looking at these circles and counting them, we can kind of predict what's going on with the overall egg population down in their ovary. We've shown through a number of years and a number of studies here in Uruguay, in Brazil, in New Zealand, a lot of our collaborators have shown that if you do the counts before breeding season and then look retrospectively, the animals that have the highest counts actually conceive earlier. So getting back to what Casey was talking about a little bit, and that idea that when we get animals bred early, they stay in the herd longer. One physiological mechanism for that is the idea of having a larger ovarian reserve, which directly relates to age at menopause. I will admit, it makes one base assumption that really can be wrong. And that base assumption is that the rate of depletion is the same for all heifers. And the rate of depletion does not have to be the same, right? You could have a heifer that starts off with a low number of follicles and decreases her ovarian reserve like this, and one that starts off with a high number of follicles and has a slope that looks like that. And by the time you reach 6 years of age, they've both essentially depleted their ovaries. There's a lot we don't know about what goes on here that is hard to do even with repeated ultrasounds without necessarily always getting these tissues and looking at what's going on in the tissues. And again, I understand I can't go around ripping ovaries out of every heifer just to do that, because then we don't have animals to reproduce. So it becomes a give and take. But really exciting along those same lines. And again, right now, all I'm talking about is heifers that are naturally born with high numbers of follicles. We'll come back to the stair step in a minute. But we've shown over a number of years through a number of studies that the uterine environment is more supportive of early embryonic development in these heifers with high numbers of follicles. So they have greater progesterone, which is the hormone that maintains pregnancy, circulating after breeding. Again, we've shown that in New Zealand, we've shown that in Uruguay, we've shown that here at the Meat Animal Research Center. We've shown that just the total protein content in their uterus is greater, and this is before breeding. So we believe the nutrients that are being provided for that embryo are better. We've got preliminary data that shows a conceptus length advantage, a tendency, but the conceptus is longer at day 16 in animals with high numbers and heifers with high numbers of follicles compared to low number of follicles. And Alex, like I said, came on board last month, and she's already started analyzing the glucose in those flushings and is showing a higher concentration of glucose in the uterine flushings of the heifers with high antral follicle counts, which again, we think would help with that better conceptus development out to the window of recognition of pregnancy. Then this is where I really started in the field. And again, this is something that's true for women and everything else. It's a little bit of an aside, and it's actually simple math, right? These are the follicles that will respond to FSH if you're trying to do some type of a multiple ovulation type of treatment. So if you just think about it, if there's more of these here and you give FSH, more of them are going to respond to the FSH, right? It's simple math. It's not rocket science. But it was like one of my first papers in the area, and one of our longest lasting effects, including the point that a lot of vets will screen donors just like we screen women before we go to hormone type treatments, because if your ovarian reserve is really poor, it's going to be a waste of money to use all those hormones. We're not going to get very many embryos. And coming back to this uterine environment thing, we're actually getting to the point where the embryo transfer industry is asking me the question, and we're trying to set up and get to the point of answering the question, if this environment is better, then if you can screen your recipients for an embryo transfer, would it be better to transfer embryos into high AFC animals because they seem to have this better uterine environment? And so we're trying to work on that. But so we get this better uterus, we actually get better development to the blastocyst stage in vitro of eggs that came out of high antral follicle count females. So again, what I'm kind of showing you is that at least when a heifer is born with these large numbers of follicles, they perform better across their reproductive life and have a lot of advantages for fertility. Now, where this study that we're publishing falls down in terms of that was that when we did the ultrasounds on these girls, there was no difference in the antral follicle number, okay? And there was no difference in calving day, the two things that typically in our hands would then lead to this greater survival, okay? But they're definitely, like I said, in 3 studies and 4 papers at this point, we have continued to show that advantage for the primordial follicles. And the correlation between the ultrasound follicles and the primordial follicles is not perfect. So it can still be real, right? That what we've done in these girls is increase those microscopic follicle numbers without changing what we can see on the ultrasound screen. And so one of our questions now is becoming, is all of this about a better uterine environment? Have we also programmed that uterus to be better? Okay, so I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about Shelby's study because there's several things that were really exciting about what came out of it. And she worked like a demon to do this study, okay? So she went to Corona or to New Mexico, to El Paso, and set the heifers up at Corona. And I really braced her the whole time we were programming those heifers and getting them and leading up to the OVEXs that this really might not happen, okay? Because I was just like, number one, I'm not sure I always believe it. And number two, you're in a completely different environment in New Mexico than where we've done it here in Clay Center, right? And then she had 2 different things. She raised heifers in the dry lot on the stair step, the way we set it up. And then she asked the question of what happens if we put them out on native range. Okay, so we have 2 different locations and 2 different effects, but let's start here. Because like I said, even though I set her up for months and then she came here in August and September and did all her histology herself. And when we do the histology, we do not know the treatments. Histology is always done blind in my lab. No one knows who's in what antral follicle count group, what dietary treatment, what stress group, all of that type of thing. And dang it, if we didn't get the same response in the dry lot. But what was really interesting was that the constant gain on the native range was not quite as detrimental to that ovarian reserve as it was in a dry lot, okay? So these girls were collected at about 36 to 48 hours after prostaglandin in the follicular phase. So these are indirect measures of fertility, okay? So a larger dominant follicle, that follicle that's going to ovulate the egg when she's in estrus, is typically associated with better fertility in cows. So we're not, in Shelby's study, we're not measuring fertility directly. But if you notice, the native range cows had, or heifers, had a larger follicle diameter than the dry lot heifers. I was not expecting this at all, which gets us back to the take-home story that I'm not sure I know all the answers. And yes, we had fun at our PhD defense making Shelby try to explain this. And her easiest explanation was that it's just better to raise heifers on range or pasture than it is in a dry lot. And again, I said, I'm not giving you an opinion, but it would be one interpretation. And more importantly, right, it's not just about the size of that follicle, it's about how much estradiol that follicle is making to make her show estrus behavior, to ovulate a good egg, and to have better fertility. And again, the native range heifers had better estradiol in those follicles compared to the follicles from the dry lot heifers. So in general, it does look like in Shelby's study, raising those heifers on native range, didn't matter about the stair step, still made them better. Now, at least for the ovarian reserve measurements, if you're in a dry lot, it looks like the stair step actually helps preserve that ovary. And so now Dr. Rosasco is an assistant professor at Wyoming, and she's already starting to set up another group of heifers for this spring. In June, hopefully, I'm going to Wyoming to collect ovaries to do the histology there. And this time around, we're really going to get uterine endometrial samples and try to compare some of the stuff we've seen out of the straight high and low antral follicle count model and see if these stair-step heifers have a actual better uterine environment, at least among the dry lot type heifers. So my biggest implication in terms of developing heifers in general is that there's still a lot we do not know. Like I said, I'm not sure I can answer the questions, even if I challenge my own PhD students to do it. Why was the ovarian development better on native range? I don't know the answer. When we look at the stair-step results on the ovarian reserve, Dr. Featley keeps coming in my office and asking this question, and it could still be asked even between the dry lot and forage comparison. Are we missing something or feeding too much of something in the dry lot, right? So we could still partially argue that a dry lot isn't bad. It's just that we're not doing it right. And there's something we don't understand, some ingredient, something that we need to get in there. And again, just like last month, and it's fine. I don't think Dr. Spangler's attending. When he is attending, he always likes to challenge me on that idea that why would just the general producer be developing heifers? And the more we get these data, the more I can kind of say that there's enough that we don't know that there probably should be specialized heifer development types of places. And Matt's strategy would be to buy bred 3-year-olds, and then we can use terminal crosses and no concern that selection for growth and carcass negatively impacts female performance. And if I didn't shotgun you too much with too much ovarian physiology or anything, I think I'm just about done. And I realize we can just move into the straight question and answer session.
Thank you, Dr. Cushman. Okay, I think we're now to an important part of the day, and that is a panel discussion. We have all 4 of our presenters here today to answer your questions. Travis and Casey are on site, and I'll ask you to kind of monitor that location for any questions that they may have of any 4 of our presenters. And Brandy and I will try to monitor the chat box to see if there are questions that come in that route. So any questions for our group today?
Yes.
You're raising the FMABFT is quite right on. As far as the gain of production, as far as being using AI bull versus the in the pasture covering bull. Is that figured on using the same qualities of bulls as you're using on the AI? Because you can get up to anywhere numbers of dollars on an AI semen versus if you don't have the same quality bull in the pen, you're not going to get the same effect.
Yeah, so your question more so comparing, did you guys hear that?
Yeah, Casey, would you mind repeating the question for the online audience?
No problem. Yep, so the question was, in some of the studies where we're comparing artificial insemination with natural service bulls and looking at some of those differences in gains of calves, are they utilizing bulls of kind of the same caliber with those natural service bulls to make those comparisons? And yes, majority of those studies are utilizing similar genetic potential and looking at those EPDs for those responses. more so with some of the idea would be utilizing that synchronization would be to have calves, more uniform calves earlier. And so then we're seeing more calves earlier with AI and heavier weight compared to a longer distribution of calves throughout a natural service season.
Great question. Anything else? I have a question for Travis and Bob, and I guess we've talked a little bit about this, Travis, but when you're developing heifers to a 55% of mature weight versus a 65% mature weight, does that have an impact on mature cow weight as they grow?
Brent, a lot of the data shows no. It changes when that occurs. And so if you're developing to 65%, she may hit her mature weight at an earlier age versus some of these low input systems, they may hit their mature body weight maybe a year later than others. A lot of the data will show they compensate throughout that first year and catch up or get pretty close. But the idea that developing to 55% will stunt their growth and they'll be smaller is not true. It can change when they hit that mature body weight. But the idea is you don't continue restricting that gain throughout the rest of that year. Bob, you got
Right.
any?
No, I think you hit it about exactly the same as I would hit it, Travis.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Well, you made some comment about the eggs are all those eggs fully formed inside wherever, fallopians or whatever, they're kept at the time when they're produced? Does she have all the eggs that she's going to have, and are they fully done, or could you change that by genetic through the cow cycle and time frame and what feed group what you're feeding to them? And like he was making a comment.
Okay, that is a really complex question. And just to repeat it to make sure everybody heard it, if I'm understanding correctly, it is the question of when does the total number of eggs form and how can you influence that? So the historical dogma is that all the eggs form while the calf itself is in utero. And by the time she's born with all the eggs she has, okay? But there is a model that includes oogonial stem cells, just like we have spermatogonial stem cells. And what oogonial stem cells would imply is that you could stimulate the ovary to make new eggs. So another potential explanation for the stair steps is that increase in energy when we bump them back up is actually driving the formation of new eggs, and that's why they have new eggs. It's really hard to prove. As an ovarian physiologist, there's a lot of ovarian physiologists who have hurt their career by trying to prove oogonial stem cells. So Dr. Friedley, as a nutritionist, likes to tell the oogonial stem cell story better than I like to tell it. I'm more, look at Mary laughing. I'm more comfortable right here telling you that what the stair step did is exactly what they showed in the rat models. And it's that it slowed down the growth and the depletion of those follicles. But if you ask me to be a true ovarian physiologist, I'll tell you there's a small chance. And if I could prove it, and if I could do it consistently, we could all probably win a Nobel Prize. Maybe Friedley gets the prize for doing it by nutrition, but there's a small chance that we are making more. And there is a chance that part of what we're doing with this developmental programming is finding ways, whether it's while she's in utero or later in her life, to make her make more eggs. So that's a great question. I'm sorry the answer is so complex from a physiology standpoint, but it is possible is the short answer.
Does that
But
help?
can you increase on the viability or whatever of that egg if during the, I'm trying to say it, through the situations that you feed and while she's getting ready to let that egg down, as far as moving it through and creating the better viability on the calf?
Okay, so now you're talking about the specific egg at the specific estrus cycle, I think. And yes, there are data out there definitely to show that nutritional management for up to 2 months before the time she ovulates that egg can actually influence the quality of that egg and what will then happen to the developing embryo, because that egg actually has all of the factors that the embryo is going to use for the first 6 to 7 days of development already in it. And you can influence what's there until the embryonic genome turns on and the calf starts making itself grow. Does that answer that part of your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Brian, do you want to cover that question that was asked earlier for Travis?
I'm sorry, Brandy.
Well, I think when Travis was done, they had a question when Travis was talking about feeding distillers. He had mentioned 2 pounds, and was that fed? I think he was asking at a dry basis. I don't know if you remember.
Like your 2 versus 1 pound per cow.
Yeah, if it was the long-term study that fed 1 pound versus 2 pounds, that was 2 pounds on an as-fed basis. So not on a dry matter basis.
Thank you.
Did that answer your question?
I think that did for the.
Okay, perfect. Okay, anything else from the group?
Oh, we got one here. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Protein, if you went to show versus liquid. Which one is better?
So the question was, if we compared wet distillers versus a lick tub for cows as a supplement.
Yeah, no one more to add on.
Okay.
If you're using the distiller, liquid have 24/7 access.
Yep.
For laser sake, we're only going to feed the distiller maybe 8 pounds less.
Okay. So really, is there any benefit over wet distillers versus a lick tub in accessibility or performance of cows between the two?
In cost.
In cost.
Yeah.
So some of the question boils down to your goals. There is benefits of lick tubs over anything else is of how easy they are to feed. I put it out.
Oh, yeah.
So you put them out and it's out there, right? They're easy to feed. They have a high cost, but with all these lick tubs, one, they're usually urea based as their protein source, and you have a high variation responsive intake. And so you think of a lick tub is this, in some instances, it's a candy to cows. They really like it up front, and they'll really go after it. But anything that hard like that, over time they get tired of it. And so your intakes are high up front, and then they start dropping. So even though you have 24 access to it, you may have 4 or 5 pounds intake up front. By the end of that, you have very low intakes, and it may even out to get your target. But most studies with lick tubs show, or anything based around that, they show no benefit over feeding a distiller or actually a true protein source. And so from a cost aspect, the distillers will beat it out. From a cow performance aspect, distillers will beat it out. From a conveniency aspect, lick tubs wins, right? And so it goes to your goals of, what's your goal with feeding that? And some And some of it is accessibility, is how often can I get to those cows to feed? And with proteins, the good thing about proteins is you can feed a protein source once per week and have the benefit of the protein, right? Cows do an exceptional job of recycling and using protein. Now, if it's energy supplement we're going after, we don't get that benefit of feeding once a week. We got to feed it daily. But so there's some ways to work around that. But from a conveniency, the lick tub's going to win.
Well, I think
Um,
stage of gestation will play even a role.
It could, but it goes back to the comment of not all proteins are the same. And the proteins in lick tubs are not as good as proteins that we get in a distiller's based supplement, alfalfa hay, etc. And so cow performance, or whatever we're looking at, is not going to be equal. You're just paying for convenience. Huh?
I would like to throw in there as well, because the other thing, we actually been doing some work looking at frequency of distiller supplementation, which 10, 15 years ago, we did some of that and basically showed that we didn't get as good a performance if we fed 3 times a week when we needed it for energy as we did if we fed daily. But recently we revisited that work because we were looking at whether or not it was because we didn't have enough room degradable protein. Doesn't really matter. The result was that feeding the distillers 3 times a week compared to feeding daily, when it's an energy source, it actually turned out to be very similar in performance. And the difference was that distillers has just a little bit less fat in it than it used to. And we think that has an impact on how it maybe affected the fiber digestion in the rumen. So we can feed 3 times a week distillers and still get a pretty good energy boost out of it, and just as effective as feeding daily.
And the difference there, if we're talking about from the energy side, is starch versus fiber. And so if we went to starch, what Mary said wouldn't hold true. But distillers gives you that flexibility. Well,
Travis, a question came in on the chat. Is there an app, or what is the best way to improve or learn how to body condition score?
so there is used to be an app, but I don't think it's working anymore. Does it, Brent?
I don't think so.
So UNL has a couple of what do they call those? Those you can go through it. Modules.
Yeah.
I don't need modules.
So there's a module on the website, and really goes through that cow, the same cow I had in that picture, to help see the different body condition scores and be able to judge that.
I think we have some video we're trying to upload.
Yep, and so we should have a little more video up. There's a few pamphlets that we have that you can get offline. The other thing is contact either your specialist or extension educator and have them come out and work with you. And that's what we're here for. Is I go out and body condition score a lot of cows with producers and go over it with them. And so from an extension side, that's part of our job. And if someone needs to learn or wants to learn it, just reach out to your extension educator or specialist. We'll be more than willing to help.
Can that change a lot from breed to breed as far as what you'd be looking for as far as body score?
So the question was, does body condition score change from breed to breed? And no, it doesn't. And so the same landmarks we use works across all breeds.
Because if you got a dairy cow or something on a Holstein, they're going to look a lot different, better.
You would body condition score a Holstein totally different than you would a beef cow. And hopefully so.
Yeah.
Because your end goal is different. So if you have a fat Holstein, you've got problems.
But you're looking at the same location
You are.
if it's a dairy or a beef breed. But yeah, your fat cover is going to be a lot different depending on a dairy versus a beef.
I will make a comment though that I see, there's quite a bit of variation from cow to cow and cow age in terms of even where they hold their fat. Like the same spots are the ones you need to look at, but you have to take the whole picture into account.
Correct. Yep.
because there's some who, will pile it on the tailhead and they won't have very much, say, in the brisket or vice versa. And so the question about breed made me think of it because it does seem like different cows do vary, and some breeds vary a little bit in where they tend to hold fat, but it's still the same location. So once you kind of figure it out, you can adjust based off of how those cows are actually fattening up, if that makes sense. So there is a little bit of, I guess I'll just say, variability that you have to account for as you look at various cows and various ages.
Age plays a bigger role in that than actually breed.
You have a question?
Now, this is very, what are the pros and cons of conservative rye, wheat, rye, anyway, for a further big round deal?
So what are the pros and cons for,
Yes, I'm not set up for silage,
okay,
just so you can look at it.
okay, so pros and cons, if you're not set up for silage, of putting some of your rye, triticale into round bales instead of silage, what would be some
Okay.
pros and cons?
Yeah. So are you thinking round bales and wrapping? So making baleage, or are you talking about trying to make hay?
Round bales and wrapping.
Round bales with wrapping.
Okay.
was-
So I would say,
Yeah.
of course, round bales with wrapping, there are some benefits from the standpoint, of course, if you're not set up for silage, you often have a lot of the equipment available, minus the wrapper, to be able to do round baling. There's a couple things that's a little bit different about round baling. One of which is that it does seem like if you're going to do making haylage out of those small cereals, you really should shoot for those earlier stages like boot, because you need to wilt them still, and actually you want to actually get a little bit higher dry matter, like shoot for 50. But when you get in those later stages, that hollow stem really makes a huge difference, and you just can't get it to wrap up as tight. And so if you're going to do round baling, I would say shoot for earlier stages, wilt it, and put up something that's higher quality, that you can either then, of course, try to limit feed or use it more as a supplement. So that's probably the negative. It's a little bit less versatile from the standpoint of the stages that you can harvest it, but there's definitely some positives from the standpoint of not having to wait, for instance, on a custom chopper. Downsides, of course, there's more plastic use per ton of forage, which means there's a little bit higher plastic cost. And then the other one that I think a lot of people don't think about is the ability to move it. And so, I mean, you can't move a pile either, but if you're going to make it in the field, you really got to figure out where you're going to put it, that's where you're going to feed it from, because most people do not have the ability to move it without piercing it. So I've actually done a lot of round baling when I used to live in Kentucky, and we would do a lot of wrapping of the small cereals. And I actually really liked it. One of the few things I didn't think about until after we started doing it was that you have to have a rather large tractor, because the weight of a bale, you either got to make them smaller to be able to move them around, or you got to have a pretty big, heavy tractor to move them. But I don't think I guess I would say, I don't see a reason why you wouldn't do it if that's what you're set up to do. It's a pretty nice system.
Oh,
So we've got a question for Mary regarding spring forages. What types of forages would you recommend putting up for spring forages, Mary? What types of forages would you recommend?
So are you talking about planting in the spring?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Well, again, that's a hard one because there's a lot of variability across varieties. My favorite has always been oats. However, if you're thinking about for silage or you're thinking about even for hay, I've actually kind of become fond of some of the forage varieties of barley lately. Some of them, like Haybet's, actually been yielding very well. In fact, sometimes out yielding some of the oats that I would typically plant. And I will say, if I'm planting in the spring, I would really suggest considering getting a forage type because they're later maturing, and that means that you're going to get greater yields, but you're also going to likely be able to harvest them at a time where they don't get too mature on you. They go really quick, just like what you saw with those winter hardy species, from ready to, oh, I've got straw now, very, very quickly. So the later maturing ones opens that window up a little bit for you and allows you to get it harvested when you want to, allowing for some weather difficulties, of course. Spring harvest as hay is really, really hard just because of whether or not we're going to get rain. Although this year it may not be, unfortunately. The weather guys are not making me feel like we're going to have a lot of rainfall. So for me, it would probably be oats or barley. If I was going to do oats, I do like Everleaf or Goliath. If I was going to do barley, probably Haybet, but you have to see what you can get a hold of. Look for a forage type.
Good question. Anything from the in-person or online audience?
I do know that they're putting in the chat. We'd appreciate any feedback you guys have for today's program and for future topics for this program. So we're always welcome to any feedback. I do know Brandy's thrown some of those comments in the chat as well for our folks online. So we appreciate any of that. Yep.
Travis, are you willing to share your information via PowerPoint with the group? We've had a number of people ask for that.
Yes, yep. I'm more than welcome to share that.
Perfect, thank you.
You were talking about adding 2 pounds or pound. How are you putting that in? Are you just throwing it out to choice for them, or?
Well, the question was,
distillers.
so how you're feeding the distillers?
Yeah, how you getting it into them? You putting it in with your other grains, or you feed them that way, or?
Yeah. So well, a lot of our feeding of distillers comes in forms of either cake or a loose meal form. You know, depending on your situation, if you're feeding a distiller cake, you know, you can feed it on the ground with less than about 5% loss. If you're feeding a milled dry distillers, you're going to have around 40% loss if you're feeding on the ground. And so, you know, so in that situation, I'd be feeding in a bunk. If I'm mixing it with feed, you know, I would, if you could get to wet distillers, you know, that may be a good option. But it really depends on your situation, how you want to feed it, or what equipment tools you have. But most ours are feeding out of a cake feeder.
It'd just be by itself.
By itself. Yep. Yep.
Oh, yes. And February, I saw Mary's comment online. February, we're doing a stalker and yearling management webinar series on Tuesday nights at 8 o'clock. More information on that can be found on the BFUNL website. And so we're talking about stalker and yearling management with some current research that's going on, some economics, and we've got a producer on that'll be kind of talking about utilizing stalkers as a drought management system as well. So those will be going on here in the month of February. Did we miss any other comments in the chat?